Hello and welcome to this lecture. This week we'll be discussing LGBTQ individuals and population. This one's really interesting, so let's go ahead and get started. There might be a couple terms or phrases or different terminology from the textbook that you might not be familiar with. So gender dysphoria is one of them. This occurs when there is significant distress or impairment resulting from essentially an incongruence between a person's gender identity and assigned gender. So essentially, they don't feel like the two match up, and so there's this incongruence or this internal conflict about how that person feels about themselves or sees themselves. Identity is huge here, and we've talked, I think, a little bit about identity kind of over the course of the semester. But it definitely plays out in this population in terms of like if there's a struggle for identity in terms of one's internal perceptions, how they view themselves versus maybe how the world views them. And if there's this contrast of that external perception or assumptions versus internal, how do you deconflict those two? Especially if individuals externally make assumptions about someone's sexual orientation or preferences. And there's also this effort to establish, if someone, say, for example, is coming out, this kind of establishing a new identity of like, who am I currently, or who do I want to be, or who am I trying to be, or what feels right to me, in terms of like that self-concept, understanding of that person trying to be authentic to themselves and live their meaningful life. And I put this picture in here because I think there's a lot of depth that goes into this. It's not just black or white or who I am as a man or a woman, but there's sub-layers within this, if you will, in terms of like there's the identity piece, there's the expression piece. Who does this person express themselves to, or who do they share themselves with or like open up to? There's the biology piece, there's the orientation piece. So there's a lot that goes into it. And I think sometimes at the surface, we just kind of stay at the surface level of like sexual orientation. But there's kind of all of these different sub pieces within that. One thing that your textbook does highlight is that LGBTQ youth are at an even higher rate for suicide or suicide attempts as compared to Black and Latinx individuals, as well as higher rates of substance use and abuse. So this population is at a much higher risk for some of those different mental health pieces or factors that could impact mental health. So that's something that's really important to be paying attention to and considering if you're working with this population or if you're working specifically with youth from this population. And that makes sense for several reasons, right? If you're someone who's a teenager and you're, there's a lot of identity angst, I think, just going on in general as a teenager, right? Like you're growing up, maybe you're a junior or a senior, there's all this pressure to kind of not only perform in high school, but make sure that you're getting good grades to be able to perform or get into a good school or a good college. What are you going to do with your life? What is your career going to be? Who are you going to be? And so there's a lot of pressure already. And then add on to it, this gender piece. It can cause a lot of anxiety, a lot of depression. So your textbook talks about this, the very first page, in terms of increased acceptance of LGBTQ individuals and, looking at kind of some stats from 1985 versus, say, 2015. And I'm sure the stats have even changed now that we're in 2024, as there's this increased acceptance of the general population towards LGBTQ populations. And it used to be like really low, like of course, back in the day, there was this inacceptance, and now that has shifted. And so that of course drives other factors, such as these myths around this idea that if a parent or a couple is LGBTQ, that if they're raising a kid, that the kid is automatically going to identify or become LGBTQ. But this has historically caused issues, and it's kind of a really sad point that LGBTQ parents have been denied the ability to adopt or foster children, or made to wait much, much longer than heterosexual parents in terms of being able to adopt or foster children. And it's been a while since I brushed up on this, but one, that's not the case, right? It's a myth. LGBTQ parents do not automatically somehow make, someone a child whether adopted or that they're fostering, that child's sexual orientation doesn't automatically somehow change. And we've talked about school performance in general, I think, in some previous lectures. But one of the main predictors of how kids do in school or how they turn out in general in life is if they have a stable, healthy relationship with their caregivers. And so if an LGBTQ couple wants to have a child or is unable to have a child or wants to be able to adopt, and as long as they're individuals who are going to provide a healthy, stable environment for children, that's what's more important than what their sexual orientation is. Because, of course, if a child is in a home where they're experiencing abuse, neglect, verbal or emotional, any type of violence, that type of thing, that impacts your your psychological mental health, and that often impacts individuals into adulthood. So that's something that's way more important to pay attention to or think about than what orientation the parents are. And of course, this drives, we've talked about this in, I think, every lecture at this point, but paying attention to what our own beliefs, views, ideologies, biases are. And this is something that for me personally, I'll self-disclose, like I was raised in a very religious household. And so, right, within that, there's not very much support for LGBTQ individuals. From a religious standpoint in general. And different religions, you'll notice, have kind of, they're taking different approaches to this. The Catholic Church seems to be kind of more open about this than maybe some other religious orientations. And so it's really interesting to kind of struggle with that internal, like, well, this is how I was raised, but how do I really feel or view it now that, I know everything that I know as a psychologist? And so kind of, again, working through that juxtaposition and those biases or those assumptions that I might make based on how I was raised, versus what I know becoming a professional in this field. So yeah, just something to think about and work through on your own in terms of, especially if you end up working with this population. There's several different examples of this. I just picked two based on TV shows or movies that I've recently seen. When we talk about living authentically, there's, again, this kind of juxtaposition of, does this person communicate to friends or family who they are, or do they kind of hide themselves and hide their true selves and almost kind of live in the shadows, if you will? So if you've ever watched What We Do in the Shadows, Guillermo has this going on in multiple levels, right? So he doesn't tell his family that he works for, like, that he essentially works for vampires, or that he's, like kind of their bodyguard, and he plays several different roles in the TV show. He tells his family that he works for the railroad, or that he works for this hotel, or, he kind of makes up all of these stories. So he's not living authentically to his family in terms of who, what his true self is, what he actually does. But he also is not living authentically in terms of, being gay or being attracted to men. And so he hides that as well through much of the show. And so not being true to himself. And then we've got Colin over here on the right. That's from Ted Lasso. And throughout much of the show, he also is not as forthcoming to the team, to the coaches, in terms of him being gay. And it ends up causing conflict later on in the show, particularly between him and the captain of the team, where the captain essentially is like, why didn't you just tell me? And so it's really interesting because he hides himself through much of the show. He'll make excuses to kind of run off and see his boyfriend, as opposed to just saying like, hey, I'm going to go spend time with my boyfriend. And so that is something that does cause struggle with this population a lot of times, not always, in terms of how do you be authentic? How do you open up and show people or let people in and say, like, this is who I am, these are my preferences. And that can cause, of course, as well, a lot of depression, anxiety, frustration, because you're not telling maybe friends or family or loved ones who you really are, especially if there's, say, family pressure or religious pressure to be a certain way or act a certain way or have certain preferences. On the flip side of that, once individuals do come out or are living authentically, it almost provides much more option or much more freedom in terms of not having to live within specific gender roles or specific gender identity, which of course can be freeing, right? We've talked, I think, quite a bit in previous lectures. I've talked about women and how women have been treated historically, and some of the like gender specific assumptions or rules or requirements around that. Women are supposed to be pregnant and in the kitchen, cooking and doing household chores and that type of thing. And so if you're able to kind of shed some of those assumptions or expectations, it can be very freeing to just say like, this is me and these are my preferences, or this is how I want to live my life. And go and do that, as opposed to, having to meet maybe friend or family expectations of who you're supposed to be or how you're supposed to be. So that is one, I think, very huge strength for this population, is once they're able to kind of get to that point, it's very freeing to just live who they want to, be who they want to be. There's quite a bit of news, and I haven't brushed up on this. This is an article from March 26, 2021. This is from Arkansas in terms of an anti-trans bill. And so I'll put the link in the description. And so there's constantly ways that we as a society can continue to improve, can continue to be better in terms of providing support, providing equality in terms of medical treatment, that type of thing. So I just wanted to include this because a big part of your midterm was including media and looking at what's going on for your specific population within the news. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when I talk about the research article. But yeah, interesting. It's a couple years old at this point, but interesting little video there to watch. Each time, something that is a specific challenge for this population is each time you come out, you have to decide who and when to disclose that information to. And this can have some therapy implications, of course, if you're working with a client who's trying to decide if she or he wants to come out to a specific individual or group of individuals, say coming out to their family or coming out to a specific friend group. And this can, of course, cause some of those short-term consequences in terms of self-disclosure or not disclosing, as I kind of talked about a little bit in the previous slide. If a client isn't coming out or has chosen not to come out to a specific group of individuals, for example, Colin, he chose not to come out to his team for the first 2 seasons, then that individual might not be getting support or the full amount of support that they could if they were to come out, right? Or conversely, it might cause a lot of conflict or issues if they choose to come out based on, friend or family's view. And so part of our role is helping clients deal with or process both the external and internalized heterosexism and other societal beliefs that they might be experiencing, some of those pressures that they might be experiencing from others. One thing to pay attention to with this population is they tend to underutilize healthcare, and we've seen that with other populations as well, such as Black individuals. And of course, part of that comes from how, that history side of things, how healthcare has treated certain populations. But something to pay attention to and to consider if you're working with clients from this particular population is, are there healthcare needs that they're maybe not going to a doctor for, and paying attention to that and bringing that up and helping the client advocate for themselves and making sure that, hey, are there healthcare issues that need to be taken care of, especially since certain healthcare things do negatively impact mental health. For example, if you've got a thyroid that's under or overperforming, that can impact depression symptoms. And so that's really important for us as therapists to know, even if it's not specifically our realm, right? Like, I'm not a medical doctor, but saying hey, maybe it would be really important for you to schedule an appointment with your doctor or getting labs done or blood work done to get that checked out and make sure that everything is good to go on that side of things. I talked about this a little bit in the previous slide, but it's also really important for us to pay attention to our own assumptions. And this is something that I've had to kind of work through and pay attention to and get some indirect feedback for in terms of automatically assuming that a client or that someone that I'm working with is straight or heterosexual. And so it's really kind of a lesson in terms of how do we pay attention to our own language. So for example, if I'm working with a client, say I'm doing an intake, I used to automatically say something like, well, tell me about if I'm talking to a man, like, tell me about your girlfriend or your wife, what does she do? How's that relationship? Or if I'm talking to a girl, like, why are you dating? What's your husband or your boyfriend do? And one day I was asking a guy these questions, and he said, well, my boyfriend, or he said my husband does XYZ, and the relationship is good, or something like that. And so it was kind of this light bulb moment for me of like, oh, I'm automatically assuming that this person is heterosexual, and they might not be. And so I've had to change that language and that verbiage to be more neutral in terms of, tell me if you're in a relationship, what does he or she do? And so I'm, opening that door or using that more neutral language, and then letting the client kind of guide the conversation from there. And then, the client will say like, well, he does this or she does this. Or I've had a client even say, I said, well, what is, your spouse, what does he or she do? And the client said, well, they do XYZ. Well, they do, they work in the bank or something like that. And so that's the client communicating, what their spouse's preferences are in terms of, wanting to use pronouns of they, them, as opposed to he or she. And so it's, again, been a lesson learning for me, a learning lesson in terms of paying attention to some of the assumptions that I have and trying to use language that's more neutral, and more open for the clients that I'm working with. Your textbook talks about aging, and this is something to pay attention to. Again, I think historically, the US and just in general, there's a lot of individuals who haven't been as open to different sexual orientations, and that is changing. But this does cause issues for individuals who are aging and maybe need to go to a home, say an assisted living facility, and are they able to go to a home that is open to their specific sexual orientation, or are they going to end up in a home or a place that is maybe not as open or maybe does have prejudices, and what are their options for that? And so your textbook actually talks about there's several different population, different supporting organizations. One is Senior Action in a Gay Environment, so SAGE, and then one is the Gay and Lesbian Association of Retiring Persons. So there's several different organizations out there that work within elderly individuals or individuals who are aging, to make sure that they have support and resources. So that's really important to know, especially if you're working with this population that is also becoming elderly. They've kind of got more than one, like, population status, if you will, going on there. I didn't talk about the video. So the video, I'll put the link in the description. It's just several different, like, movie or video, TV show examples of individuals coming out and how that's handled, very well, or very poorly, as the case may be. Higher levels of discrimination. So this is one big stressor, and we've kind of talked about this in previous populations as well. This population is at risk for higher levels of discrimination, harassment, microaggression, physical assault. There's that shooting at a bar, like, I think and it's been a couple years now. Population is at risk for maybe receiving poor services at businesses. And again, I think a lot of this has maybe changed in, from, say, the 60s or the 50s, but there's also still a lot of room for improvement, as there is still a lot of discrimination occurring, and you could easily pull up all kinds of examples of that in the news. But I think it's also important to pay attention to not only what are the areas that still need to be improved on, but also what are we doing well in, right? Not just only focusing on, like, well, this news story has this negative thing to say, or this bad thing happened over here, but also what are the good things? What are the ways that we as a society are improving or are creating policies that do support this population? So looking at both sides of things, not just one side. So I'm kind of trying to keep the lecture short because This is one of the lectures where you guys will watch a documentary. There are probably newer or more updated documentaries up there. It's been a couple years since I've updated this, so I'll have to do that at some point. But I found this documentary really fascinating, really interesting, some great information in here. There's two different versions. There's a 30-minute and a 60-minute. This one is the 60-minute version. So part of your discussion post will be discussing what your reactions were to this documentary. So here are the discussion questions for this week. Again, complete both questions. You don't have an option to complete one or the other, just do both. And then research, I'm not going to talk about get into all the details again, just wanting to highlight, again, a big part of your midterm was media representation. And so I'll just kind of get to the results were that while traditional media, particularly television, creates a common dialogue and validates identity, it continues to represent LGBTQ people as one-dimensional and stereotypical, and often ignores LGBTQ subgroups or limits young people's perceptions of their future trajectories and offers no opportunities for critique. In contrast, emerging or new media offers new and important and valued spaces for discussion, creativity, and maybe can offer a little bit more dimensionality to LGBTQ individuals as opposed to kind of that one-sided or stereotypical view. So this is important for us to pay attention to because most of us consume media quite a lot throughout our day. And we might not, again, be as aware of it as I talked about. Like, we're constantly, in a previous lecture I talked about, we're constantly being advertised to, whether we're aware of it or not. Facebook or, Instagram or whatever it is. And even within, if you're on an actual news site, there's usually a lot of advertisements. Anyways, I won't get on my pedestal about that. But paying attention to what are media representations, whether that's a newspaper, whether that's seeing a website, what is being portrayed about these individuals, and how do we pay attention to it, and how does that impact our views about this specific population, and then how does that end up impacting, for us as counselors or therapists, how we're interacting or working with someone in therapy and supporting that individual throughout therapy. So some really interesting research here. And then I wanted to include this because at some point I kind of went down a rabbit hole of just watching a bunch of documentaries about this. And so I found this documentary as well really interesting. This specifically discusses transgender individuals and how they're portrayed in film specifically. I found it really fascinating, so I was like, oh, let me throw it in here. So definitely worth watching if you have the time. Ooh, that's loud. And these are my references, so let me know if you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns. Thank you.